What not to do, common mistakes in grant writing. I have no disclosures to report. Firstly, let's talk about sources. Where should those of us who are not experienced at this get our information from? Fortunately, there are lots of sources and it's probably worth seeking out a range of them. Expert opinion can be really useful, and we've had lots of that today. Speaking to your mentors or local experts is a great way to get the feel for grant writing and some good tips. However, there's also a wealth of experience available on the internet from successful grant writers and funders. As with any online source, quality is really variable, and you should look to reputable websites rather than Google searches. Higher education institutions, for example, will sometimes have a grants hub website, such as these here, where in addition to funding opportunities, they can also direct you to resources to help with applications and other useful information. I've put up two here from American university sites. And it's important to note that context-specific information relevant to your local setting may be more important depending on what you're applying for. But distance sites often also do have easily navigatable general information about writing and processes that may be worthwhile and are often open and accessible to all potential applicants. There are also specific grants hubs, although finding some relevant to your local context is again important. Some of these also are subscription-based sites, and it's important to get an assessment of their value to you before signing up, and whether they actually add anything additional to what you might have access to through your own institution. Higher education publications, websites or journals sometimes also have expert articles or tips that are well worth reading, or even short courses from experts on various aspects of grant writing that might be worth seeking out. Online resources like Twitter and YouTube also have plenty of material, but seeking reputable sources is particularly important on these platforms, which are unselected. And finally, podcasts can be a really user-friendly way to listen to information. And this one, for example, from the NIH deals with their particular applications. To put this talk together, I've used a number of these sources that I've referenced and collated a list of common or useful mistakes that were highlighted across articles or sources. I listed them here, although it may be a bit difficult to understand from this list. I'll go on to explain them in a bit more detail now. This list is, of course, not exhaustive, but does highlight some common themes and recommendations from reviewers, funders, and experienced grant writers about mistakes that are frequently made and pitfalls to avoid in putting your application or grant proposal together. A strong focus on science is, of course, critical for any scientific grant application. However, a common mistake is to neglect the substantial administrative aspects that go into any application. That is, only focusing on the science can be a problem. Administrative components can be really onerous and seem unnecessary, such as in this cartoon. See the bewildered look that the NGO applicant is giving the process that does look ridiculously complicated. But making sure you tick off all the boxes isn't just good practice, it's absolutely necessary. And there are a number of strategies that can help do this. First, and most obviously, read the guidelines, and the earlier the better, to be able to plan your approach. This might seem self-evident, but actually very few people will read them before launching into their draft proposal, and it will mean that you start off on the right foot. Changing the font and borders can be much more onerous to correct later, and setting up correctly to start with can save you a lot of work. There are also many subtle hints in guidelines that can tell you what and how to write. And they're usually fairly explicit about what you shouldn't include. Sometimes it can help to speak to those funding the grant or your local grants admin people to help understand what they're asking for or what is required, especially if some of it doesn't make sense. And apart from the instructions, it can also help to get a successfully funded example of the type of grant you're writing, how long are the sections, what information's been included, and how the grant flows. Perhaps the most important component of this is identify what deems eligibility for the grant application and ensure you meet the criteria before applying. If you're still unsure after reviewing the application details, contact the organiser, as they'll usually have a representative ready to assist. This one is related. Give yourself time. Writing a grant application can be tricky, and allowing time to deal with all the various components is really important. The longer you have to prepare for the application, the more high quality your submission will be. I got this infographic from a university grants website, and it illustrates the multiple processes involved from getting from the beginning of having the idea of writing the proposal to the end of submission. You should also expect the unexpected. Plan for unforeseen issues and time to contact the grants team behind the application for help if you get stuck or have questions. Writing is really hard, and experienced writers recommend devoting plenty of time to this part and state that it can take months to get a big grant together. Scheduling should also include planned time for rewrites, proofreads, and secondary reads by friends, colleagues, and family members. And planning to submit the application ahead of time can be a useful strategy. Working right up to the deadline could undo weeks to months of hard work if you, for example, submit an earlier draft instead of the final version by mistake. Submitting early also allows an extra buffer for tech malfunctions during the submission process itself. Organisation is really key here, and there are heaps of tools that can help with time management, of course, that are not specific to grant writing and that you'll probably already be familiar with, such as using tools like a Gantt chart. And finally, it's worth remembering that sometimes the grant process doesn't necessarily end with the submission. You might receive requests for rewrites or for more information. And even rejections can come with feedback, and if they don't, you can request it, which might help for the next application. As it says here in the box in blue, and if this doesn't fly, I'll take feedback and resubmit. Number 3, square pegs and round holes. You might have heard of this phrase before. It refers to trying to get a shape into a space into which it doesn't fit. Or some of you might have seen these sort of children's toys in which the aim is to fit the right shape into the right hole. It's a similar thing. For grant writing, there are a couple of messages I'm trying to get across here. Firstly, too often we can start with a compelling research idea, but aren't willing to adapt it to the stated priorities of the organisation we're asking for money from when we come to write a proposal. The proposal needs to highlight responsiveness to the funder's interests and priorities. So understanding what the funder actually funds or wants to fund is really important. Sometimes passion for your own great ideas can lead to the perception that funding agencies exist to fund the sort of research that we want to do. But unfortunately, that's not the case. A funding agency exists to fund the type of research the funding agency wants to see happen. And it doesn't matter if it's the Australian Research Council, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome, the National Science Foundation, or the Slovenian Science Foundation. They all have often government-set funding priorities. Know them and follow them. Another message is this. Sometimes you'll need to modify your research plan to fit into the framework or make it seem more attractive for a particular funder. That is, shaving off some of the corners for the square to fit into the round hole. This can be a bit of a fine balance. You don't want to compromise your ideas or research plan too much, but you do need to be practical and optimise your chances of getting funded. And this is where reading the guidelines can be really important. Trying to think about, for example, whether there's a particular slant or angle that you could put on the proposal to allow it to fit better within the framework the funders have provided. Number 4, I've called it So What, but a better title might be Significance and Rationale. Average or unenthusiastic responses from a funding agency to a proposal can often be linked to low scores on the project's significance and innovation ratings, with a few minor methodological and theoretical quibbles. But it's important to consider whether more specific criticisms on methods and theory might be less important than considering bigger questions or objections the reviewer raise or might ask, such as so what or who cares. Justifying the application is really important, and the significance or rationale is a particular criterion on which many applications are assessed. So how do you do it? Explaining the applied outcomes of the research, if there are any, is a critical aspect, but also why they're important. In other words, why does the funder, or more broadly speaking, society, need to invest in your research? Perhaps they shouldn't if there's no practical benefit resulting. Explaining how your results will affect the real world can be helpful. And try to avoid using the rationale only that it will provide humanity, you or me, with just more knowledge or better understanding. Number 5, too ambitious. Ambition is good, right? How can a proposal be too ambitious? According to experienced researchers, a characteristic of junior investigators is to be over-ambitious, or perhaps, better stated, unrealistic. For example, proposing a 5-year project in a span of 3 years. These types of proposals get dinged for feasibility. Or proposals that verge on the fantastical because the proponents purport to solve the mysteries of life, the universe, and everything in their project. Without lessening the impact of why your research is important or significant, don't venture too far into fairyland and claim you'll be able to solve all elements of the problem under investigation. Stick instead to your clearly defined hypotheses and do what you can within the budget and timeline proposed, making sure your application is achievable. This has to do with your language in the proposal as well as your overall vision. Conversely, though, it does seem it's also important not to promise too little in a proposal. It's hard enough to identify the ideal scope of a research project, but many researchers also fail to align the proposed scope of work with the time period specified by the agency or the amount of money it has available. It's also important to keep in mind this may vary by grant application. So you might need to modify the application to fit with the specific guidelines each time, which goes back to reading them carefully. Number 6 is a bit of a different one, but this one definitely came across in all the sources I looked at to put this together. Some articles call it the loner. In the past, grants were often viewed as a one-person show, a single investigator assisted by graduate students. Not anymore. Agencies and foundations tend to value projects that require cross-disciplinary participation, and it makes sense. Incorporating novel research perspectives requires one or more co-investigators to ensure these perspectives are integrated. And for clinical studies, as we've found, in COVID and so many other things, multiple small studies can lead to erroneous or misleading results. To really be meaningful, working in groups or collaborations is key. Fortunately, this problem is an easy one to solve. Adding another investigator to lend credibility to your proposal can be really useful. And more, seeking out other researchers and interacting to facilitate development at the ideas stage of your project can be the most useful thing of all. Of course, this takes on a whole new complexity in the COVID era, depending on your local settings and rules, which have hampered many of our usual networking opportunities. Research development professionals on campus at your institution might be able to help, as there are often networks to facilitate connections among faculty members. Collaboration makes you stronger, no matter how you do it. You can't be an expert in everything, so identify your limitations and collaborate to fill the gaps. The next few tips are about trying to think from a reviewer's perspective. Although many of us don't review grants yet, we often have had experience in reviewing journal articles and papers. Everyone is busy, and like all of us, reviewers are tired and just trying to get everything done. So making things clear and easy to understand can be really important. And there are many ways to do this. Make it clear at the start what you're planning to do and what key questions you hope to answer in your project. The language you use is important. Don't expect the reviewer to connect the dots. When connections are missing in what you're describing or proposing, you might not like what reviewers come up with on their own, so lay it out for them. Think about, or better still, find out who's reviewing your proposal. Is there a layperson? Are they an expert? It's unlikely that all panel members will be experts in your field, so use clear, simple language and explain all abbreviations and acronyms. Avoid them if possible. Jargon is also not helpful in a proposal. Assume the assessor has no knowledge whatsoever of your field, because often they won't. A reviewer wants to be told a story, and as we all know, it's much easier to read something that flows well. Number 8, too many words. This is related. Not only are reviewers tired and busy, they're also likely to need to read dozens of applications, often while juggling their own research or work. Many of the topics might be about complicated subjects that lie outside their own fields of expertise. So think about how you as an applicant can make things as easy as possible for them. Formatting is an important consideration. White space and bold headings can make proposals easier to read. There's often a temptation to squeeze as much information in as possible. The trick's fiddling with the margin size or making the font a bit smaller so you can squeeze in one last sentence. But this often actually just makes things exhausting to read, and you lose sight of the point. To prevent the reviewer's eyes from glazing over, use clear and direct language instead of multisyllabic jargon, and keep sentences short. When technical details are necessary, follow up a complex sentence with one that sums up the big picture. Inserting infographics, tables, and visual data can help enrich the proposal and increase the likelihood of it being read completely. An effective picture really can convey much more than the words used to explain it. Limitations without solutions. Don't present limitations and assume the reviewer won't care. Some people try to hide the dust under the rug in a proposal by including throwaway lines about how they'll achieve their objectives. Be specific and address potential limitations of a proposal, or turn weaknesses into strengths. And finally, not asking for feedback. By far and away, the most common mistake referred to is not asking for the hard feedback. Once you fall in love with an idea, asking for critical feedback is really hard, but it's really, really important and one of the best learning experiences, both from an editing point of view, but also from an ideas point of view about how you're laying out your own ideas. So after this brief run through of common mistakes in grant writing, here is a summary of what I've covered and some of the suggested strategies to address them. Reading the instructions and following them, anticipating time management needs, matching research and donor priorities, emphasising and explaining significance and rationale, being realistic and specific with your aims and methods, leveraging collaboration, making the text easy to read, follow and understand, and using infographics, asking for and adjusting to feedback, and acknowledging limitations but suggesting solutions. Thanks for listening.